Welcome to another episode of Breaking Into Cybersecurity. Wow, Andy, thanks for coming on. I see that you recently launched a new book, and I am excited to have you on to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Christoph. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I think myself, both on this podcast as well as everywhere else, is focused on trying to help leaders develop and having great reference materials like your book. Ordered it already. It's in the mail, just waiting for it. So
Yep.
excited
Hopefully,
to
it's sitting on your doorstep right now, and when we're done, you can run out and grab it.
I hope Amazon delivers that quickly. That would be just ingenious. But until I get to read it, maybe I could ask you a couple of questions about
Absolutely.
how it can help both current and future leaders in developing their careers.
Absolutely. So, I wrote this book as an antidote to a lot of the leadership training and leadership books I've seen out there. And stop me if you've heard this before, but there's so many of these trainings and books that there's like a cult. They say, here's like the one true way to be a leader. And they're often like an autobiography or a biography of someone or a summary of some niche research done by an academic. And it says, this is the one thing you need to do. And if you just do this over and over again, you'll be amazing. And the reality is, like, what will work for me will not work for you, will probably not work for somebody who doesn't look at all like us in some certain organizations. And like, this doesn't really help people. Either that's something you're already doing, in which case you get validation. Oh, yes, great. I should keep doing something I'm already good at. Or you've tried it, it doesn't work. So 1% leadership is written on the philosophy that there is no one true leadership style. There is just getting a little bit better every single day. I think of leadership like a rope, right? And a rope is braided together. And the more strands you have and the stronger each individual strand is, the stronger your rope becomes. And so if you can make every strand in your rope 1% better, or every link in your chain, if you want to think of it that way, 1% better, like, you get stronger and better, and you don't have to make these huge changes to see anything. Now, for some people, some of these practices that I go through, and there's 54 of them, will be completely novel, and that will be a big change for them to try that practice. But other ones, they're going to be like, oh, I do that already, but now let me do that with intentionality. So that's the idea for how it will help people is it gives them a framework to work within to improve, but they get to guide themselves or work with a coach who can use these lessons and strategies and say, oh, like, you're having a problem with hearing feedback. So let's read the chapter about hear unbelievable things to find your blind spots. And that chapter might resonate with you to let you realize that when people are telling you things that you don't think are true, maybe what they're telling you isn't quite true, but it's a signal about a blind spot that you need to deal with.
I love that approach. Yeah, you're right. As a coach, we definitely see that there's no one true way to anything.
Yep.
And that most books have been written more from a mentorship approach where they're sharing their experiences, but that doesn't always relate to everyone. So I love the idea of the 54 practices that you can try and choose your own adventure to that.
And they're
How
organized.
did you come up with that?
So the 54 was just, I started writing, and that's where I ended up with. Although my wife has a joke about it, which is we had 55 and we're considering dropping it down to 52 so we could have fun with it being like one a week or whatever. And the publisher finally just said, don't force it. But then when we were doing the editing, we cut one and it became 54. And what's fascinating is 54 is actually the number of weeks for Jews when they're reading from the Torah. There are 54 weekly portions that some years you get to all of them and some years you don't, because we have a variable length year. So my wife often makes the joke that, like, just like when you're reading from the Torah, you take different lessons. That's what this is. Like, you can read like one a week. And here's the other thing I've done. If you've read a bunch of business books, and I have some on my bookshelf behind me, you'll often find that it's the same message, just repeated for 300 pages. And they never actually tell you what the message is. You have to figure out what they're trying to tell you. When I wrote 1% Leadership, the title of every chapter is the lesson. So when I said, hear unbelievable things to find your blind spots, that's the title of the chapter. It's in the table of contents. It leads the chapter and then it closes the chapter. And at the end of the book, I have a summary of every chapter, which is, again, the title of the chapter and then 2 sentences. The
Nice.
idea is I want to make it easy for you to find the lessons and figure out which ones will work for you. And if it's a coach, I've started actually writing some coaching guides And so I've been putting them on my Substack. I know that you subscribe to it, so you see them. And the whole point of those guides is to say, hey, if you have this high level problem, here's a set of chapters that might be relevant so that you can use those to start.
I love that because reading yourself always allows me to contextualize lessons that you're sharing, and I've loved subscribing to that. So we'll definitely include that in the show notes. But
Awesome.
for someone that is trying to grow and they may not have a coach, I love the approach that you could do one a week or something like that. And like atomic habits,
Yes.
you keep going and going until you get that habit on down pat and then move on to another one.
Absolutely. If you're an
So I
Atomic
love that
Habits
approach.
fan, like this is a perfect sort of follow up to focus on the habits for leadership. Now, let's assume you're listening and you don't have a coach. First of all, think about getting a coach, but you can approach this book without a coach. It's organized the lessons scope. So the first 18 chapters are about personal leadership because when people talk about authentic leadership, what they really mean is I look at you and clearly you lead yourself. The things you tell me to do are things you've evaluated for yourself. So these are really individual lessons that are designed for one person. So it's things about like your wellness is your greatest asset. Like if you don't take care of your own health, it's hard for it to be believable when you tell your staff, oh yeah, go take care of your health. Because they'll look at you and they'll be like, you've been running yourself into an early grave. And the people who are doing that on the team are getting a promotion. So you don't actually believe that I should take care of my health if I want to be employed by the company. So these are lessons about you, your affect in the world. And so if you're just starting your career, start with these 18 practices because you can go through them, you get to read them and say, "Ooh, I like that one. Let me jump to that." Or that one sounds weird. Let me go read it to see what I want to, if I want to focus on it. Then the next 21 chapters, I didn't evenly divide them, are about team leadership. And this is really what focuses, the leadership lessons are focused on how you interact with another person and the people who work with you. How do you manage a small organization? And when I say manage, I really do mean like it's a leadership. It doesn't have to be that you're the boss. Like you might be a senior individual contributor, you might be a junior one, and just understanding how that team dynamic you can lead from the side. The last set, which is 15 chapters, is organizational leadership. You probably need to be in a more senior role for a lot of these to be relevant, but they're good for you to look at and listen because they're about how do you manage people at multiple steps removed. Like, how do you make sure that when you tell everybody wellness is important and you're the boss of a large organization, that your managers are actually telling that to their staff? Because what often happens is we say, oh, wellness is important. And then our staff says, we have deadlines. And so, how do you build an organizational structure? And these lessons apply in a corporate environment, they apply in a community environment. Like if you're part of a nonprofit or just a group of friends, you can think about how you lead in those environments.
You said something and I picked up on it. You said look and listen. I'm a big audio fan. Is this coming out in a audio release as well?
It is actually coming out in audiobook as well. You could, in fact, I think you can get it today. The reader for it is me. So you'll get to hear
Oh,
my lovely voice. Yeah, I recorded it back in early January. And then in March, I had to do what's known as pickups, which is they went through and they found the few things that they wanted us to retake. And it's fascinating because I got to sit there. I actually had a professional narrator in one ear who, like, as I'm speaking, would be like, just stop, go back. You screwed up a word. We'll just redo that phrase. And it was actually really hard for me because I'm not used to people who will do micro editing between words. So I would always finish a sentence, then I would get used to going back. And he's, don't bother. The moment you misspeak, we just want to go back. And the first day I was doing the edits, it was like he was calling like 90% of the edits. And then the second day I called 60% of them because the moment I misspoke, I would just stop and say, okay, I'm going to go back.
yes. And that's one of the things about doing a live podcast is I don't edit. I just go straight to the air.
Yeah. And it's a big trade off when you're doing a podcast that's about getting timely information continuously out to people, then you can accept it's a trade off of lower audio quality. And yeah, my coughs come through, it gets out there, but it's a much lower cost to perform to get content in front of people. When you're doing an audiobook where you get one shot at recording and hopefully thousands and thousands of people will listen to it, it's worth that extra time. And my total time was less than 20 hours.
That's not too bad during the size of the book from
Yep.
reading the details on it.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty
Um,
short book. It's only about 45,000 words.
only. So as you went through, how did How long did it take you to capture these lessons? And just to give the reader a sense of perspective as to your experience.
I've been learning these lessons my whole career. So I started in leadership at the Disneyland back when I was still in high school. I worked there. I was a foreman in costume issue, learned a bunch of lessons. Like Disney, and this one doesn't actually come out as an anecdote directly in the book, but you can see where it'll tie into values. Is when you get your performance review at Disney, everybody has basically the same form. There were, at least at the time, there were variants of it that were more complex for more senior people. But the first thing you were rated on was safety. The second was Disney courtesy. And the third was job knowledge. And then there were a whole bunch of other things. But it was this very clear organizational leadership message about what mattered to Disneyland. Like, they don't care how well you can do your job if you are rude or unsafe, period. Like, they have set their priorities. They would rather have a very safe, polite person who's mediocre at the job than the amazing person at the job who is putting people's lives at risk and like your guests hate because you're selling an experience that is safe and courteous. So that starts. And in fact, I have a Spirit of Disneyland award on my wall because I embraced, like, I did costume issue. My job was give people clothing. It's either the start of their day and I'm the last face they see before they go in front of guests, or it was the end of the day and I'm the first face they see after 8 hours of dealing with guests. You learn a lot about how much you can affect other people's emotional states when you're in that world. After Disney, I was a bartender, again, where I had to learn to, I made a living based on just how I communicated. Then I finally went back to school. I had an outage of school. I was in college for a year, got kicked out, came back, got my degree at MIT. I was in Air Force ROTC. You get a lot of leadership training. It is not all relevant or practical, but you do get a lot of it. Sometimes you learn things that are not what they meant to teach. I spent 3.5 years in the Air Force, so medically discharged, and then spent 21 years at Akamai, where I ended up as the chief security officer. I led a team directly of, I think, 94 people the day I left, over 40% of whom were women, which is a staggering rate for the cybersecurity industry. And then from there, now I work in venture capital and I work with a lot of startups, including Orca Security. So I've been in a lot of places. I've learned a lot about security. I've learned a ton about leadership, often not the lesson someone was trying to teach me.
They say most lessons are learned from mistakes, and
Absolutely.
the best consultant or salesperson is the one that sells the mistakes.
It really is. And I'll say that's one of the chapters. I should have had the chapter list in front of me so I can remember exactly what numbers they are. I don't yet have them all memorized, but it's in the first section. And it is that, even when you don't succeed, you can get a great story. And so much of my leadership comes out of those stories that at the first I just embraced the story because I didn't know what the lesson really was. But over time, you learn what the lesson is. And you're like, oh, that's what I take away from it. And then sometimes you're telling yourself the story even years later, and you're like, oh, that was a good lesson that I learned, but there's a better lesson if I'd paid more attention. And so remembering those stories for yourself about failure, and then at the organizational level, back to your sales point, another lesson about this is that failure is an opportunity to provide great customer service. Right. And it's my belief that you cannot be a great customer service organization if you don't fail, that it's in the moments of failure that you can elevate your practice to greatness. Otherwise, you're good and you can be good. But the companies that you think about and the brands that have great customer service, you remember them because how they acted during a failure, even if it wasn't theirs.
I think we saw that in the recent travel debacle at Southwest.
Absolutely. How many other brands leaned in and provided great customer service because they said, we will help you if you just got straight.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So mention something about remembering the stories and pulling the lesson out of that. Do you have a lesson on that?
Oh, absolutely. So the lesson does start with you. You have to, it's just to remember the stories because I don't want to try to build this really complicated lesson, right? The goal isn't to say, oh, you should do this and then this. It's really, here's this one thing that you can go do. So really, so that lesson is, it's actually chapter 5. I just pulled up the chapter list. Even if you don't succeed, a story about failure can be a reward. But now you tie that with other lessons that you can really go for, which is, if I move back to chapter 14, it's retain the confidence of the new learner and temper it with the caution of the old hand. Right. And here I'm talking about the Dunning-Kruger effect, which,
Yeah.
by the way, not actually real. We could do a whole podcast on how that's actually bad, non-reproducible research. And I can, if you want, I'll dive in on that. But the key when people talk about it, why it resonates with us, is sometimes you feel like an imposter. And sometimes you feel like, and you don't even realize it, but you're so overconfident. And usually you don't see it. Everybody else sees when you're overconfident. You see when you're the imposter. And the reality is you want to navigate right in between those two lines. Like you should do things that you're not qualified to do, that you don't believe you're qualified to do, that someone might look at you and say, oh, you have overconfidence bias. Like you think you can do this thing. And while you're doing it, you should be there with that little bit of anxiety, should not be crippling, that says, I'm an imposter here. So any failure I need to learn from quickly. So I will do things outside of my comfort zone and I will learn quickly from them so that they become part of my comfort zone because I can't afford to repeatedly fail when I'm stretching myself. Right. So you
Yes. Yes.
combine those chapters together and there's your lesson, which is, oh, tell yourself the story of failure. Now apply this concept of how am I going to learn to it? And so you can put these lessons together in any way that would make sense for you.
I love that. Totally choose your own adventure. Um,
Absolutely. Because these are micro atomic lessons.
and so you mentioned in your Substack how you also combine stories for that. What made you want to create so many different ways to reach out to your audience?
My goal here is transformative, and it's a really big goal. Like, talk about having imposter syndrome. I want to completely transform how leadership training in this country, actually on this planet, functions. I think we do it all wrong. We wait until people are senior executives or managers to give them leadership training. When we make people even managers, what most companies give them is manager training. We teach you how to interact with HR. How many companies don't teach you how to develop mediocre employees? And by mediocre, I don't mean that as an insult, the middle of your distribution. You have 10 employees, probably one of them is amazing, one of them is awful, and 8 are in the middle. How many companies teach you how to grow and develop those 8 people? Almost none. Yet that's 80% of your workforce. Why would you not be focused on that 80%? Right? Instead, what we do is we say, okay, that one that is awful, here is how you manage them out of the organization. Again, we don't say, here's how you improve them or how you get work out of them. Here's how to get them out of the organization. And it's a wicked expensive process because we're afraid of being sued. So everything you're going to do there is about liability protection. And then like you have this amazing person and everything is about how do we keep them from quitting? So how do we keep throwing things at them to satisfy them? But again, we force them to develop themselves. And so what I want to do is I want to basically say, here is a set of practices. It's not the only set. If you think these 54 things are the only 54, I'm sorry, I'm not that good. But these are a great set of 54. But if you have somebody in your family who is graduating from high school this year or from college, this is a great graduation present because here's things they can start using today that will help them grow. And it could be they're in chapter 9, which is one of my favorites, which is regret is an act of forgiveness to your past self. Like oftentimes when people think about mistakes they made in the past, they have one of two narratives in their head. One is, oh my God, I wish I could take that back. It was so bad. And they get stuck in this defeating loop about what a bad person they are. Or they say, I'm okay with how my life has turned out. Therefore, I will not regret that bad thing I did. And neither of those is healthy, right? The leadership moment here is to say, I do regret what I did then, and the me now would be different. How have I grown? And let's keep growing. And it's this like really simple thing, but you need to do that so that the people around you who maybe you harmed in the past want to keep interacting with you because they see you've grown. You don't always have to make reparations, although I do talk about the value of an uncompelled apology, but you really have to be continuously developing from day one. And that's what I want. I want people to develop from day one with practical advice that they can choose from and they know what's hazardous. The longest chapter in my whole book is the introduction. Because in the introduction, like I include a cautionary tale. Like, imagine learning how to swim, right? Hopefully you know how to swim. You might remember how you learned how to swim, but you do it in the shallow end of a pool with somebody who is supporting and holding you, right? And if we say, oh, look, here's, even when there's advanced ways, things you want to learn to swim about, better strokes to be more efficient because you're going to go do a race, you often practice and learn those in very safe environments. We do not throw people into the Orinoco to get eaten by piranhas while they're learning to swim. but some of the corporate environments are like that. So
Yeah, they
you
just
have
throw you in the deep end.
they throw you in the deep end. But if you took some of these chapters and said, oh, like I talk about the uncompelled apology, there are organizations in which if you apologize, like you're doomed. Like you're like, oh my God, you're so weak, nothing will happen here. There's some bad leadership there. It needs to be fixed. But I want to start with a cautionary note that tells people as you notice these lessons, think about the environment. And if you're the leader making space for people, part of your job is to clean up the environment so that there's a safe place for people to learn.
Wow. I love that. Yeah. Like you said, all too often, there isn't that safe environment for people to fail. And especially in technology and cybersecurity, we need to have that Broadway dev environment where
Yep,
levels of failure are almost expected in order to advance. And I think when it comes to leadership, they don't do that. It's
absolutely
you're a
not.
supervisor now or you're a manager now, and you're expected to know it all.
Yes. And in fact, it's funny because I actually have two different chapters focused on that very specific one. So one is about the team management. It's one of my favorite chapters, which is an apology budget allows your team to take risks, right? If you have people that you're asking them to try something new, they should recognize that you have a budget for advising on their behalf to your peers. Like if you work for me and I ask you to do work and you fail at it, I'm going to apologize. I'm not going to throw you under the bus. Now I'm going to go to my peer and I'm going to say, look, this was a development opportunity for Christoph. I should have provided more support. I should have noticed this wasn't working. I should have corrected it so you weren't impacted. It's a leadership failure. And here's what I'm going to do to be better about that. I'm going to make sure both for Christoph's sake that he has better support. I'm going to give him specific ways that he can help repair this relationship, but mostly this is on me. And that's okay. But you now, if you've seen me do this with your peers, you're like, great, it's safe to take risks here.
Yep.
And Andy is learning that sometimes he over delegates, right? And sometimes he needs to delegate more and he's going to learn that. And then there's a second one, which is actually at the organizational level, which is really one of the last chapters, chapter 52, which is really a commentary on product management in many companies, but it applies everywhere, which is if you aren't regularly failing at future bets, you aren't taking enough risk. So
Yeah.
if you never have to apologize for the failures of your subordinates, you are not taking enough risk in developing and training them and giving them opportunities. Like they need to fail because that failure tells you that you're taking enough risk with them that they can grow. If you only let them do very safe things, they will never learn to do the things that aren't already safe.
And that goes for business too, because a risk comes both with positive and negative rewards. Positive rewards are profit and cash
Yep.
flow. Rewards are you have to close down a product, you lose customers based on those decisions. I think all too often people look at risk only as a negative
Yes.
and don't look at what's the positive that could be gained from that.
It's a risk reward trade off for everything. And I think we sometimes separate risk and reward rather than realizing it's just this balance of what you're doing. And your goal is to get the rewards. Well, in leadership, the reward is when the people that you developed surpass you. So I'm looking at all the people who used to work for me and all of the positions they've moved into and the leadership roles they have. And some of them are still developing. Actually, all of them are still developing, but some of them are very senior in the industry, some are very junior in the industry, and I'm watching them. And that's my reward. And I want that reward for you, for your listeners. Like, I want it to be that everybody who buys the book or gets it gifted by a friend or whomever, like, they get better. And even if I personally see it, I'll know that's the reward that I want. My risk was 3 years of my life writing the book.
And as an author myself, I can say that's the best reward that we could have from seeing if impact ripple across those that have read the book. And
Yep.
Andy, thank you so much for coming on. Before we go, what's the best way for readers to get the book if they haven't ordered it already and keep track of you?
So, best way to get the book is find your favorite bookstore and buy it from there. Obviously, all of the online bookstores have it. My hope is that your local independent bookstore has it. You can get it anywhere. As an author, I try not to tell you exactly which store to buy it from. My royalties are the same wherever you get it from. So really buy it from wherever you're going to want to get it. Keeping track of me. So one way is obviously my Substack newsletter, which you're having the show notes, but it is Duha, Duha, 1, andy.substack.com. You can find me there. You can find me on any social media platform pretty much. I'm some variant of CSO and on many of those. Easy to find there. If you manage to listen to this podcast the week that it's dropping in, then next week I will be at RSA and I will be doing signings of the book in a couple of different places. So if you want to buy it at RSA, at the RSA bookstore, I'll be doing a signing there on Monday at noon. I will also be doing a signing at the Orca Security booth on Monday night during the welcome reception, but there will only be a limited number of copies that we'll be giving away there. We will be giving away copies in exchange for your contact information. But like, I recommend buying a copy of, but if you have bought a copy of the book and you bring it to me, I will sign it there happily. I will also sign it like anywhere you find me. I think we'll have copies at the Wild Ventures party on Wednesday night. I think those are all the places that I know you can find me and the book. But stalk me on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. If you want to buy a bunch of copies for your organization, especially once you buy it, you can read it yourself. Come talk to me. I'll talk about what it might take to come in and do a leadership talk or a workshop with your organization.
Absolutely love it. And hopefully Orky, who's there in the background, will be able to travel to all those events as well.
Yeah, he'll definitely be at some of them.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andy, for joining us on Breaking Into Cybersecurity